Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are putting on our detective hats. Seriously, we're stepping into the shoes of a literary investigator to crack a mystery that's been cold for about 2,000 years.
So, our story starts way back in the ancient world. There's this letter written to a small community in a city called Colossae. And you can tell right away the person writing it he's really worried about something. He issues this very direct warning.
He warns them about a hollow and deceptive philosophy. You can just feel the urgency in those words. He's convinced this new teaching is a real threat, that it could completely undo everything he'd taught them before.
Here's the thing. The text never actually names it. And that right there is our mystery. So, to solve it, we can't just read the words on the page. We have to become investigators. We have to look behind the text. And to do that, we need a special set of tools. Okay, so let's get into it. Our main tool is something called historical criticism. Now, don't let that word criticism throw you off. It doesn't mean being negative or tearing something down. In this world, it just means using sound reasoning to figure out what something really means. So what is it really? Think of it like this. Historical criticism is all about putting a piece of writing back into its original world. It's a way to look behind the text and understand who wrote it, who they were writing to, and all the cultural stuff that was going on at the time that shaped it. Now, I should mention, this tool has a bit of a controversial past. When it was first being used, some scholars kind of came in with a bias against the supernatural, trying to explain away miracles. But that's not really how it's used today. Now the goal is simply to shed light on the historical context to help us understand what the text is actually claiming, not to dismiss it. All right, so with our toolkit ready, let's head back to our mystery in Colossians. If we treat this letter like a crime scene, what kind of clues can we find about this hollow philosophy? Turns out, the text is just packed with clues when you know what to look for. The author talks about rules about food and drink, observing Sabbaths and festivals, this weird focus on false humility, and even the worship of angels. People are bragging about mystical visions they've had, and there was this really strict, harsh treatment of the body. These aren't just random details. These are our fingerprints, our key pieces of evidence. Okay, with all these clues in hand, we can finally start to build a profile of our philosophy. It's time to line up the historical suspects and see which one really fits the evidence we've just collected.
So let's run through the lineup. Some early theories pointed to something called Gnosticism, but the timeline just doesn't work. It didn't really exist as a full system for another 100 years. What about pagan beliefs? Well, that doesn't explain all the clearly Jewish stuff, like the food laws and the Sabbath. The evidence, when you look at it, points overwhelmingly in one direction. It had to be some form of first-century Judaism.
So, what does this all point to? Well, our hollow philosophy was most likely a mystical kind of Judaism, a group that was all about strict rule-keeping, having these incredible visionary experiences, and angel worship, which, by the way, are all things we see in other Jewish writings from that time, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Paul wasn't fighting some foreign religion. He was worried that this very intense, mystical approach was going to completely overshadow the main point, the centrality of Christ. And what's so cool is that this technique isn't just for this one mystery. Cracking the Colossian codes shows you just how powerful this kind of historical detective work really is. It doesn't just solve one case, it can unlock the original punch and meaning of other ancient stories that we think we know so well. For example, take the Good Samaritan. For us today, that phrase just means a helpful person, right? A kind stranger. But to the original audience, whoa. Samaritans were seen as historical enemies, as impure. So for Jesus to make a Samaritan the hero of the story, that would have been absolutely shocking, maybe even offensive. The context gives the story back its provocative edge. And you see the exact same thing with the story of the prodigal son. When the son demands his inheritance, he's basically saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead." But the real shocker, it comes later. In that culture, for a respected old man, a patriarch, to hike up his robes and run, that was a deeply humiliating, undignified thing to do. So the story isn't just about the son coming home. It's about the father's shocking, self-humiliating, and very public display of love. So what's the big takeaway from all this detective work? Well, it really all boils down to finding the right balance. This tool, historical criticism, it's incredibly powerful, but it also comes with a big responsibility. You see, there's a real danger that our cool historical reconstruction becomes the main event, and we forget about the text itself. But that's not the goal at all.
The goal is to use all that background information to illuminate the text, to let the world behind the words make the words themselves come alive. It's like walking a tightrope, trying to carefully balance the context and the content.
At the end of the day, understanding the world behind the text helps us recover a richness of meaning that's so easily lost to time. And it kind of makes you wonder, right? What other ideas do we think we understand that might look completely different if we only knew their full history?